З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання. Хто ми? Куди ми йдемо? У що ми віримо? Якою мовою ми спілкуємося? Яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність?
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Доброго дня, слава Ісусу Христу. Я дуже радий
Good afternoon, glory be to Jesus Christ. On behalf of the Ecumenical Studies Institute of the Ukrainian Catholic University and on behalf of our partner, Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung in Ukraine, I'm happy to welcome all of you at this panel discussion dedicated to the topic of cultural identity during wartime. The war wielded an enormous impact on Ukraine. It became a great shock for Europe and the entire world, and there will be a ripple effect for cultural identity. This is something that we can already see in the religious issue, in the linguistic issue. So I really hope that we will be able to glean some nuggets of wisdom from all of you. I'm very grateful to all the panelists for their participation, and a separate thank you goes to Ms. IRYNA STAROVOYT. She put together this panel discussion and she will be moderating our discussion. IRYNA, over to you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who joined us from different corners globally. We are delighted to welcome you at our panel discussion entitled Cultural Identity During Wartime. This discussion also comes as a surprise to me, but I put together this constellation of speakers, and it's a great honor and pleasure for me to announce that our participants will be Dr. Patrick BOULTE, Dr. MYROSLAV SHKANDRII, and Dr. MAKSYM ROZUMNY. First of all, I would like to give the floor to the honorary president of the SOLIDARITÉ France-Poland Association. He also represents the Association of the Responsible Investment Forum, Dr. Patrick BOULTE.
Деталі щодо перекладу, чи це правда?
Так.
I think we need to explain how simultaneous interpretation works. If you want to listen everything in Ukrainian, please find a globe symbol at the bottom of the Zoom screen and pick the French channel. On the French channel, you will be able to hear everything in Ukrainian. And if you want to follow everything in English, please pick the English channel.
And now we move on directly to the first speaker.
First, I want to thank the organizers to give me the opportunity to contribute to this interesting conference on a subject not so frequently addressed. I propose to address the question of the strategies used by the contemporary individual to overcome the crisis of ordinary sources of identity at a time in history when he can, at least in Western countries, no longer rely in the conduct of his life on strong collective identities, and where shared cultural references are challenged by simple patterns of consumption and mimetic behavior. You will excuse the comments coming from a society not directly affected by war. They may present a discrepancy with the experience lived by those who are directly confronted with it, with what it involves in terms of survival, destruction, loss of elements of one's life environment. I will try to analyze the role of the cultural system and the way in which it is taken into account in the functioning of our democratic societies, before finally questioning myself on the possible effects of the war in Ukraine on the system of identity construction in Western European countries. And the question, to what extent does the environment in which we are facilitate or complicate the essential work of individuation for everyone, work that is becoming essential for democratic viability? Before addressing this point, a few reminders on the elements of the identity crisis. First, identity strategies in globalized societies. This has led me to measure the new importance of the identity issue in a society marked by the phenomenon of individualization, and consequently to try to identify the types of strategy implemented faced with this question of identity, depending on the resources available to individuals. First, the strategy of identification through social roles, including professional ones. Second, the strategy of avoiding the question of identity through distraction in the Pascalian sense of the term, or by grouping with the same, as seen with the proliferation of microsocial networks. Third, the self-destructive strategy of destroying oneself as instance of identity questioning, as may be seen in the question of addiction. Fourth, the strategy of individuation by way of interiority, the question of the quest for a base. What evolution for the two strategies, those with a positive contributory effect? We acknowledge an increase in the level of requirements for the exercise of roles. It means an increase in the number of variables to be taken into consideration, an additional amount of information to sort and process, an increase in complexity resulting in the number of operating diagrams, instruction for use, access code to memorize, and so on. An increase in incivilities to be repaired or compensated, incivilities themselves resulting, no doubt, from the insufficient attention span of individuals too busy scrutinizing the messages addressed to them permanently on their smartphone screen. As for the process of internalization, the obstacles accumulate. An unfavorable arbitration of time against space. I'm referring here to the request for ubiquity as to the vacuity of time experienced as a drama. An accentuation of mimicry reinforcing the difficulty and the fear of being by oneself. The systematic embrittlement of symbolic systems that can serve as benchmark and give a feeling of continuity, stability, and rootedness. So it is what, for me, the situation boils down to. An individual somewhat left with own devices in terms of identity construction, having resources of variable geometry, and led, among the available strategies, to adopt one of them, which will have neither the same cost for him nor the same benefit for society. Second part of the subject, faced with individual problems, there is social functioning and its imperatives. The sociologist Talcott Parsons, one of the references of Jürgen Habermas, distinguishes in the functioning of a society four interesting subsystems: a system for setting objectives and decision-making. This is the political function. An adaptation system is a technical and economic function, a system that can fail, as can be seen today with regard to adaptation to the natural environment. A social system that ensures the integration of actors, provided that all of them are taken into account. Finally, a cultural system ensuring both continuity, the maintenance of models, and the orientation of the whole. It is this system that structures, finally, the commitment vis-à-vis the ultimate reality. It is through his own cultural system that the individual understands himself in his continuity, that he assures himself of himself, that he orients himself, that he situates himself in the common whole, that he participates in what makes sense for everyone, therefore, in the development of the common world. The cultural system is what allows self-understanding and mutual understanding among all. In other words, the cultural system is the combination of the systems of meaning of individuals, systems that ensure the feeling of self-continuity, the orientation of its action, the possibility of entering into a relationship with the other, supposed to operate on the same pattern as oneself, the ability to feel responsibility for others, the possibility of living together. In a non-totalitarian society, it's not the result of an explicit decision, of an injunction. It is made up of the combination of individual cultural systems which themselves feed on the information received. The messages can be of various orders and contribute more or less to the construction or destruction of individuals. They are insignificant messages, no doubt, the vast majority. They are messages that tend to impose themselves through repetition or through a deterrent effect. For a long time, institutions were more attentive to the development of norm than to the mechanism of individual functioning, to their mode of reaction to events, and to the need of the individual. In response to this trend, it can be noted that the Catholic Church is in the process of reorienting its attention from theological deepening towards greater anthropological understanding. They are messages conveyed by the practices, founding messages of the confidence necessary for the development of individual systems of meaning, insofar as the practice are congruent with the statements of the principles which underlie them. They are messages that the individual will feed on and will use the content for their self-edification in a continuous and formalizable process. Perhaps the individualization of societies results in a profound modification of the sources of the cultural system. It would be nourished, constituted less by inheritance or by codified knowledge, and more by interpreted personal experience. This would be a considerable change, as it would entail both the reduction in the weight, if not the relevance, of dogmatic experience. The need for an anthropological understanding of the mechanism of self-construction, the increase in the state constituted by individual experiences in the constitution of the cultural system, as well as the material of this experience, which is the event. An increased demand for reflexivity for individuals, but also the need for collective consideration of what such a demand requires. At the level of society as a whole, the cultural system both feeds on and contributes to individual coherent systems. The stakes of the cultural system are all the greater for people when they are excluded from political ties and social ties. And now, what are the possible effects on the war in Ukraine on our system of identity construction? Admittedly, it's too early to observe and measure all the effects. Already, we can say that it has planetary repercussion, even if the shock wave is not yet fully felt by our societies in Western Europe. 20% of people in France who responded to a recent investigation answered the question about Ukraine. I am obsessed with it, it's horrible. Compare to 75% answer, it's serious, but I admit that it doesn't change my life. What reflection can we make if we go back to our analysis grid of identity strategy? In a way, we are sent back to the situation that we thought we had overcome, which is a reintroduction in our universe of questions of survival, of collective belonging, of the challenge of spirituality and interiority. Through the economic tensions it provokes, it calls into question the implicit collective project of unfilizing the sole increase in production as a mean of proposing a collective goal valued by people and provider of personal, professional roles that give them a raison d'être, a project already disrupted by the obligation to include ecological constraints, that they create a risk of recession and therefore of a decrease in the pace of creation and sophistication of professional roles, which, as we have seen, individuals particularly value for their identity definition. The return of the tragic in our history, linked with to the consequences of the previous phenomenon on our income, will gradually, as we become aware, have effects on the effectiveness of the strategy to evacuate the question of identity through distraction. The reality of what is happening on our continent will gradually catch up with us more easily in any case than when it concerns other more distant parts of the world. The two other strategies, that of self-destruction, that of individuation, are linked. What is gained by one will be lost by the other, and vice versa. The factors that play and will play to tip the balance one way or another seems to me the following. The example given by the Ukrainian people and known by the multiple channels of communication created and developed recently can be a source of inspiration for a society like ours in France, which no longer believed in the possibility of forming a community. Everything will depend on our attention span and our self-confidence, but also on our awareness of the vital nature of our necessity. Are we able to choose life and to choose what this choice entails. Another determining factor is played out by the political level, which certainly does not have the means to act on the cultural system, and which, moreover, is not its role, but which nevertheless has levers to activate favorable action to social cohesion. They are of the order of discourse and educational action. Discourse, first of all, to tell the meaning of what is at stake, to direct people's attention, to make the cultural issue credible, and to revalue it in relation to other issues which tend to mobilize the attention of individuals, and of which we realize how insignificant they can become in a situation like the one facing Ukraine. Then training policies. The causes and effects of the outbreak of the Ukrainian conflicts go far beyond, in the eyes of the whole world, any rational justification that has been given for it. Its anachronism, its absurdity are obvious at a time in history when humanity is asking itself the question of how it has put its environment in a capacity to continue to ensure its life. It remains that the need appears without knowing if this will be enough to increase our knowledge of the conditions of the variability of humanity and to work on our identity, solidity. I thank you for your attention.
Ми дякуємо за цей початок
And we are
розмови.
also grateful for this beginning of our conversation and for the theoretical framework through which we could see the cultural system where cultural identities by design would be helping to elaborate shared cultural context. These identities split, they are in conflict with each other, not always cooperating with each other, and to take into account all these identities is becoming almost impossible. The planet is one, and there are lots of us, and although we are not alone in our identity, but this harmonization and this social cohesion we cannot achieve anymore. I think that Dr. BOULTE only lightly touched our situation and the Ukrainian context, but I think our audience can be assured that if we have allotted this section within the 15th Ecumenical Week, it's exactly because we want to talk about Ukraine as well. We want to focus on Ukraine. And that's why I pass the floor with great pleasure to our second speaker of today's evening. It's Professor MYROSLAV SHKANDRII, who is art specialist, researcher of identities, and Professor Emeritus of the University of Manitoba in Canada. The floor is yours. Thank you for invitation. I will be speaking in English, but I can speak Ukrainian.
And I will try and give my impression, and this is only an impressionistic account of the way Ukrainian culture, the attitude towards Ukrainian culture has changed in North America, and perhaps the way Ukrainian culture itself has changed. I think the first thing to say is that since February the 24th, there has been an enormous change. And it has affected the way culture is viewed, not only in Ukraine, I believe, but also in the West and the East, and in various communities throughout these geographical spaces. It's probably important to begin by saying that the attitude towards Russia has changed. Many people viewed Ukraine and Russia, many people in the West, and in Ukraine, I suppose, viewed Ukraine and Russia as closely linked. In fact, a sister culture, a common culture. What has happened since February the 24th is that this link has been severed, has been broken. The imperial aura of Russian culture has disappeared or is in process of disappearing. The attitude towards history, the past, the relationship between Ukraine and Russia is now being reviewed. And in fact, the nature of Russian culture itself is being reformulated, rediscussed, reconfigured throughout various programs, throughout various university courses. And there's a tendency, I think, now to look at the negative aspects of imperial rule. So, for example, it would be, the hegemonic, the aggressive, the bigoted. These aspects of Russian culture are being looked at very carefully now. And assumptions about Ukraine and Ukrainian culture are completely being revised. So I think if you look at the twin Russian-Ukrainian relationship, there's been a profound and a dramatic shift. And a lot of people are interested in Ukraine because they have discovered it for the first time. In my courses, my students very often come from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and they're all extremely interested in discovering what Ukrainian history is, what Ukrainian culture is, why this country suddenly appeared with such force in North American media. I should also say that there's been in the West, I think, in general, but I can only judge from Canada and the US, a change in the prestige of the Ukrainian language and the prestige of Ukrainian culture. That means publications, music, films, museums, exhibitions. Everywhere you look these days, there is some exhibition or some performance or some translation into English of some Ukrainian writer. There are films being produced now by Western directors, but who are visiting Ukraine and doing films on the war. And there's a tremendous interest in what the texture of life is in Ukraine. Many artists, to give just one example, many artists who were thought of as being Russian are being reclassified. So if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York here, the MoMA, the artists who were classified as Russian are now being that is being revised. They are being described as Ukrainian. Certain works are being described as Ukrainian. And in the writing of history, many figures are being included in the Ukrainian narrative, in the Ukrainian process, in the development. And that means Kazimir Malevich, it means Vladimir Tatlin, means Alexandra Exter, but it also means people like Sonia Delaney, who said that she was Ukrainian, David Burlyuk, who said he was Ukrainian. They become part of a wider narrative, international narrative, describing Ukraine and Ukrainian culture as an international phenomenon. So all this, I think, has affected the West. I'm not really how Ukrainians see themselves, but I have some ideas, and it seems to me that what has happened now is that the long history is being rediscovered. So instead of just talking about the last 30 years or the last developments, there is a tremendous interest both in Ukraine and abroad in what happened in the 1920s. This flowering, this renaissance of the 1920s in Ukraine, the 1960s and the dissidents, and going back even further to the 19th century, the Baroque period and earlier. After all, people raise the question, if this country and this culture has existed and survived for hundreds of years, we have to think differently about where it is now and why it appeared now. Now, I think also I would like to say a few words about the nature of Ukrainian culture itself, what is being emphasized and what is being de-emphasized. There is a huge discussion now in Western media and in Western academic circles among professors and students about post-colonialism and decolonialism. And Ukraine figures very prominently in this because it's a prime example, it's a case study of decoloniality, if you want to put it that way. There's a tremendous interest in violence in culture, because if the Russian culture was an aggressive, hegemonic, and unyielding, oppressive culture, that means tremendous violence was exercised towards Ukraine. So that is something that needs to be discussed and analyzed. Serfdom, invasions, cycles of oppression. And then the other part of that is resistance. Ukraine, one of the courses I teach is about cycles of upheaval, cycles of revolution in Ukraine over the last 100 years. Ukraine has constantly resisted. So 1917 to 1920. And then there was a counter-revolution, what I call Stalin's counter-revolution, 1930 to 34. Massive repression, the famine. Then there was a Second World War, another resistance movement appeared. And then the 60s, the dissidents, and then the Euromaidan. These are waves of resistance popular resistance from Ukraine. That needs to be integrated into one narrative, and it is being integrated in Ukrainian culture. I think it needs to be understood better in the West, but there is a curiosity and an openness to understanding it. And then what Patrick spoke about, solidarity. One of the incredible things about Ukrainian culture is popular solidarity at various levels. It can be seen in collective behavior, in collective organizing, because when you resist against a hegemonic power, you have to organize the ordinary people. That solidarity has come as a shock. The current solidarity during the war was unexpected in the West, and it has stirred a great deal of interest. Another aspect of the way culture is being rethought or being seen in a different way is the emphasis on military history. Ukrainians now always talk about the Sichovi Streltsi, the Sich riflemen, about the UPA, about the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the UNR, about the Cossack period. There is this military tradition, and I think that is seeping through not just Ukrainian self-awareness, but also in the West. People are beginning to see a military history, not just a rural peasant mass, and I think that is beginning to change. perceptions in the West. The attitude towards statehood, Ukrainians are quite right. Throughout the last century, they have been quite correct in saying that statehood is important, that we have to win statehood. And although they've been called nationalists and Banderites and various things like that, there's general awareness that statehood changes everything. And therefore there's a recognition in the West now that it's not an obsession of some small Ukrainian groups, but it is a requirement that Ukraine be secure in its statehood and be able to defend itself. I think that's been a huge change. And maybe lastly, but not least, the language question. The Ukrainian language is now viewed with a certain degree of prestige. It is becoming cool to speak Ukrainian, which is very interesting. It's also led to quite a few people switching to Ukrainian. And this is noticeable among Ukrainians who I've come across in the West, who used to speak right in Russian, exclusively in Russian, who have switched to Ukrainian, or who are now attending classes in Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture. This is part of a broad movement, I think. Films are now being produced by people who never thought of themselves as Ukrainians, but have discovered themselves that they are of Ukrainian background and want to visit, learn about Ukraine, and produce and have become really admirers of the Ukrainian cultural resistance, and have produced films about this. Now, this conversion experience to Ukrainian, because I study Ukrainian history a little bit and Ukrainian culture, that conversion experience has occurred in the past. It occurred in the 19th century. Quite a few major writers suddenly decided they were Ukrainian and switched to their identity and switched to their language to Ukrainian. The same happened in the revolutionary period, 1917 to 20. The same happened in the 1920s. The same happened in the dissident era of the 1960s. And it is happening again today. So this is a very interesting flip towards not only defining yourself as Ukrainian, but actually using the language. I think that's something that's quite interesting, quite unusual, and quite typical for Ukrainians. And I'll mention last of all that there is now in the West a huge new generation of young scholars, people not always young, but very often young, people who have been, who've left Ukraine, some temporarily, some for a longer period of time, but who are now in various departments, programs, visiting scholars, visiting fellows, or just students. And they are beginning to affect how Ukraine is viewed. They take part in discussions, they organize cultural events. And this is a huge change. This is fueling a huge change in Western attitudes, particularly from my point of view, because this is what I can see in Canada and the US. Many Ukrainian writers are now touring, giving, their books have been translated into English and they are on tour. So in conclusion, I would say that there has been a sea change, a huge change of attitude towards Ukraine, particularly in the West, but also I think it is because what is happening in Ukraine is stimulating these changes of attitude. Thanks for your attention.
Я дуже дякую за цей панорамний погляд і за цю густину різних тем і
And I'm
підтем.
grateful for this panoramic view and this density of your vision and all the topics that you have touched in order to show us what is happening in these seismic shifts and these seismic shocks that are somehow meeting each other, because the Ukrainians themselves are also rediscovering and re-accepting their culture. The similar process is taking place within the academia, in the public sphere, and in mass consciousness of Ukrainians. And this requires changes and shifts on both sides, not only from the side of Ukrainians who are changing their own self-narrative and their self-assessment, but also from the side of our Northern American partners who are now open and wanting to listen to Ukraine, to hear more about Ukraine, and now they even are ready to change inscriptions next to certain surnames from Russian into Ukrainian. Many years ago, Ukrainians were fighting for this, but they failed to change this, and now it's happening. Now we switch our attention to our third speaker, MAKSYM ROZUMNY. He is the author of a book that was published shortly before the war. It was called National Doctrine. And in that book, he touches our Ukrainian history of the last 30 years, as if summarizing the 3 decades of our statehood, of our national statehood. And MAKSYM, as Myroslav SHKANDRII said, that we need to have this protectedness in order to develop our culture. So this issue is also raised in that book. So I am absolutely sure that we will have an interesting and resonant discussion after this presentation. That's why I pass the floor to MAKSYM ROZUMNY. Professor ROZUMNY is speaking to us from the University of Haifa, but he's also a Ukrainian political scientist who worked in the Institute of Strategic Research and in the Kiev University named after Drahomanov. Hello to everyone who is with us at this conference. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers and our moderator, and to the participants who have already made their presentations.
Some of the statements have already been articulated, so I will skip some of the things because they were elaborated on, but I would like to revert to the key concept, the concept of cultural identity, and also the second concept in question, the war. There's a very interesting aspect between these two realities for the academic community and for ordinary citizens as well. There's a very interesting nexus here. I cannot really remember the source right now, but there's this opinion that modern nations emerge predominantly out of wars. So the national awareness during wartime is much stronger during wartime. And if we talk about the current war in Ukraine, and if we place it in the context of the Ukrainian cultural identity, on the one hand, it's a result or a consequence of 30 years of statehood building, political nation building. But on the flip side of things, it's a turning point. It's a watershed moment. It's something that requires a fresh look and something that requires a new understanding. I will do my best to offer some of my inputs, but of course, I cannot really claim that my statements will be comprehensive and complete. The matter is that in terms of Ukrainian identity, the war doesn't really change cultural identity per se. What we are discovering right now, what Myroslav SHKANDRII was talking about, this is something that has been obvious for a long time for the Ukrainians living here and even for people in other countries as well. But the war fleshed out these issues, and now these issues are being discussed by a larger group of people. So this cultural identity, its components, its content, its essence have become not just a subject of political discourses, but now it's also a topic of public interest. I would like to point out that during wartime, cultural identity does not really change per se, but priorities and modalities do change. The first effect that I would like to draw your attention to is that cultural identity, like any other identity, for example, individual identity that Dr. Patrick BOULTE talked about, is multidimensional. And national identity is only one component there. But during wartime, national identity becomes the key one, especially in the political context. It becomes the decisive one. There's this divide between insiders and outsiders. National identity, the national identification of the culture phenomenon, language, names of streets, monuments, titles of books, because we can see what is happening, that some books are being burnt. So all these attributes, all these characteristics are being rethought, reframed. So we're trying to understand what is in line with the national identity and what is incongruent with it. And there are some either identities that become subordinate, for example, ethnic identity. Ethnic identity becomes a subject of cultural reflections, but not as a self-sufficient attribute, but as a precondition for national identity. The same holds true of professional identity. I illustrated the example of discussions that were unraveling in Ukrainian civil society. There were some discussions around professional identity in the context of religions. You have the church subordinate to Moscow or the church subordinate to Kyiv. I have a lot of friends on Facebook who are Greek Catholics, and they exhibited certain responses to the Pope's statements. There's a sort of prioritization of the national dimension of culture during wartime, which is natural. But at the same time, there are some other dimensions that come into play. There are some other differentiations that become pertinent. For example, modernism, postmodernism, or return to archaism. I don't really have enough time to take a deeper dive into this topic, but the ongoing war also resonates with some of the wars that we had in the 20th century. So we have to think in terms of modernism. And postmodernism takes a backseat in this context. While some people return to the archaic form of culture and awareness under the influence of the ongoing war. I will try to accelerate a little bit because I can see that I'm running out of the time allocated for me. What should be emphasized here? New requirements for culture are emerging. New requirements for cultural phenomena and those people that work in the realm of culture. One of such requirements is cultural ambivalence, cultural ambiguity. And this is something that is not really accepted by the society affected by the war. So war culture requires clear-cut concepts and clear-cut terms. There was one concept articulated today that became quite fleshed out: decolonization. In my book and on other public platforms, I discuss and contest the notion of decolonization. My position is that Ukraine is not a colony and has never been a colony. Ukraine is a typical province. A province and a colony are two different things. Ukrainian culture is largely provincial. Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian society were pressurized by the empires, but at the same time, Ukraine is not a colony. Among our ancestors, we had people who contributed to the creation of this colony, if you want to use the term colony. We didn't really have some other people come here and impose colonies on us. But right now, this topic is highly debated and discussed in Ukraine. You need to have clear-cut concepts that will help you fight against the enemy. We need to have a feel for the difference between the status of province and the status of colony. And it might look like a cultural whim or a cultural freedom. And in the conditions of the normative nature of cultural identity, this idea does not really resonate with a lot of people. But I think that later this interest might emerge. Myroslav SHKANDRII mentioned that there are a lot of discoveries right now. Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian cultural identity has a new status right now, and maybe this status will find its development in the future, will find its positive development. That said, we also need to point to certain threats and dangers. During wartime, there is this need for an ambiguity, and we can see all this translated into certain taboos. It might not be noticeable in the external context, but when you are a direct participant of the Ukrainian culture, when you are within the Ukrainian culture, you do understand that in the situation of the war, in the situation of this juxtaposition between insiders and outsiders, there are certain taboos. And this is something that requires cultural participants to be unequivocal, to be unambiguous. And we need to look for cultural factors, not some relative factors or contentious factors. I would like to share some final thoughts and statements about the future unfolding of the situation from the perspective of cultural identity during wartime. Ukrainian cultural identity will definitely have more influence both inside Ukraine and outside. There's this expectation that a lot of people will discover Ukraine both within our country and beyond it. But as for internal development, internal enrichment, and the deepening of the cultural content, this is something that will take place at much later stages. In the near future, the Ukrainian culture will continue experiencing this trauma, and it will still be subjected to this wave of patriotism. Under such circumstances, we should not really expect some cultural masterpieces. I don't really want to theorize on this topic. I just want to refer to some examples of cultural situations after the Balkan Wars. We know some Balkan cinematography, Kusturica, and some other ones. But this is a look from the outside. This is a look at the war from the outside. We can also refer to Marquez and the Latin American prose that also experienced this national mobilization at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, but these new cultural forms emerged much later. It goes without saying that the Ukrainian culture is experiencing self-survival right now. We are fighting for our right to live, and the conditions for its development, the conditions for expanded horizons will be created a little bit later when the war situation is over with all the subsequent imperatives. So basically, we have to wait until this final self-determination. Thank you very much. Well, of course, I hoped for a discussion, but I didn't even think that our discussion might be so acrimonious. Definitely, I want to give an opportunity to the other two panelists to respond to everything that has been said, but I would like to summarize Professor Rozumny's statements. This is something that resonated with me. Can the forecast of Ukrainian cultural identity and development be positive in the first days after the war? And we can also have this discussion about decolonization. There's another statement that was not explicitly articulated, but it was the centerpiece in all three speeches. Do hybrid identities exist, and what happens to them during wartime? This is something that Professor Rozumny slightly touched upon, but I'm pretty much certain that there are some other questions in this regard. So if you allow me, I would like to give the floor to each and every panelist to respond to the statements of one another.
Following your span of thoughts.
Professor BOULTE, would you like to be the first one to respond?
Well, I feel a great gap between the reality lived in Western countries like France and those lived in Ukraine in a state of war. I try to express the idea that the French people were on a way of individual identity. The problem is individual. and the war of Ukraine put them facing to a collective problem, and that they are not accustomed to. So they are progressively switching their attention from their individual situation to a collective situation, and that the process is going on, and it's not ended. We have to observe how it goes, but now it's too early now to see that. In the previous conference at the beginning of the afternoon, it was a question of the impact of interiority and spirituality, and I think that a probable tendency will be to deepening of or putting to each one the question of his spirituality and interiority, but it's to be verified. It's too early to speak about that. That's what I wanted to say.
Дякую. Дякую дуже. Я на
Thank you very much. As a moderator, I would like to point out that I believe that Ukrainians have had to make a lot of life determining decisions in the past several months. So basically, those have been the decisions that determines the future of their family members, their towns, their communities. And I think that we also demonstrated this amazing capacity for converting abstract ideas into real, tangible actions that work towards the protection of something shared, something united, something that goes beyond individual interests and desire for self-survival. So from this perspective, I really hope that maybe that gap even is not there, so that Ukraine is creating some examples or cases of how this situation of individual self-expression can be regulated under existential threats, and how it can all promote cultural and societal cohesion that we did not have in the past. And there is another phenomenon that we are observing in the Ukrainian society. This phenomenon is very mosaic and pluralistic, but we are much better at managing our conflicts, so we can come to terms with our internal conflicts and contradictions.
Згідний з тим, що ви сказали, I agree very much with what you say, and I think one of the wonderful things about Ukrainians is their ability to cooperate, collaborate, and work together. I do not believe that there is a single Ukrainian culture. Cultures are not monocultures. They are not single things, and they change throughout time, through generations. The isms of the past are reconfigured, they change, but they all together, one after the other, form a link which creates that culture. I would also say that when I use the term Ukrainian culture, I talk about all ethnic groups, all religious groups, all political groups. Ukrainian culture was created by Poles, Jews, as well as Ukrainians and other nationalities. And in the 1920s, for example, there was a renaissance of Jewish Yiddish culture parallel to Ukrainian culture. Now, today, on the front lines, Muslims, Jews, Ukrainians fight together. That's a wonderful thing. That is evidence that a democratic culture, an inclusive culture exists and is being created. And that wins great sympathy abroad. It explains a great deal about the nature of the solidarity in Ukraine, and it's a very positive thing. One of the enormous mistakes, from my point of view, I'm speaking subjectively here, but from my point of view, one of the enormous mistakes of Ukrainian struggles, military struggles in the past, has been exclusivity. In 1917, many groups simply rejected non-ethnic Ukrainians. Not even that, but also people who spoke a different language, who were Ukrainian ethnically, but spoke a different language or were perceived as being part of a different culture. And the programs of the programmatic statements of the nationalists during the Second World War were also exclusive. They were not inclusive. That is a mistake. It is a mistake politically. It is a mistake militarily. You want everybody to be on your side. You want everybody to fight for you. And I think the great thing about today is that this is in fact happening. So the idea of a monoculture, I think, is dead, and it should be buried. There is also the gender issue. 1/5 of all Ukrainian soldiers are women. They have their own cultural, if you like, understanding. They demand to be viewed, to be seen, to be visible. That's a positive. That shows the pluralistic, the polyphonic, the integrative, inclusive nature of Ukrainian culture. Now, I think that what's happening, from my point of view, you can look at just the monuments. If you go to a park in Ukraine, or if you talk about monuments anywhere, Ukrainian monuments anywhere, there's always a struggle, a contest. Whom do we commemorate? Whom do we place a monument to? How do we do it? Which monuments do we take down? And I think that the problem there is that you can go in the direction of exclusivity too far. People who were communists in the 1920s were nonetheless Ukrainian patriots. Khmelevy and his groups, many of those people were communists, Marxists, but they were also fighting for the national cause. Do you take down their monuments? Do you, as happened in emigration, do you destroy their works, saying that they were communists? I think you have to be broader, wider, more understanding in your view of culture and cultural developments. So these are just some of my views, which I agree. This is a rather controversial, but a very interesting and very important discussion.
Дуже дякую. І хоча тема деколоніальності не стоїть у
Thank
заголовку.
you very much. Although decolonization is not entitled in our topic, I cannot help reacting to this thesis because I've been thinking a lot about this. And my trace of thought is the following. Historical time is moving forward. I don't know, shall we see it as Hegel's spiral or some other way? But I wouldn't like to think that we are going back in time, that we are experiencing deep postmodernization or demodernization or a kind of archaization. It's not a step back, it's a move forward. And of course, in our mental framework, something may be changing and something may be recalling our previous times, but still this is not something that was 30, 50 or 100 years ago. Another point, it's about Ukrainian coloniality. It's great to be a Ukrainian now in 2022 of the 21st century. It was much worse to be a Ukrainian at the times of Shevchenko, and especially hard and harsh it was to be a Ukrainian when you would be born the same village where Shevchenko was born, in the status where he was. And when I read his poems in 1848, he described our Ukrainian negrititude, when Ukraine was just a province, when Ukraine or Ukrainian lands and Ukrainian culture were a metropoly in regard to the Russian or Moscovian. But there was also a time, and it was not a brief time, when Ukraine was a colony. And social history of Ukraine is so complicated that one may not notice it if we look only at the destiny of nobility. But if we see at the serfhood, at the peasants that were serfs, if we look at the epoch of Holodomor and the artificially created famine, Ukraine indeed was a colony. And this is my opinion, my view. Yes, thank you. Exactly. A very interesting discussion. In this context, I asked a question whether Tambov Gubernia was a colony at the times of Shevchenko. But it is indeed a complicated discussion. But I would react in the following way, so that we could go back to what has been said already by the previous speakers. When we are building in our imagination, because it's the only way we can do it, in our imagination, when we are building in our imagination some holistic Ukrainian culture, then this inclusivity that was emphasized by MYROSLAV SHKANDRII is very significant, because if we narrow down everything that we consider ours and cast aside everything that we find suspicious, especially ethically suspicious, or maybe by some other criteria, if we identify some cultural activists by their beliefs, there is a risk that we will narrow our roots and our heritage and our legacy, something that we can return on to later. We may turn our house of Ukrainian culture too small, and we will not find enough people to live in that house. If to generalize, this is the collision that I see currently, a collision that under the circumstances of war is kind of decisive. That's one statement. Another statement pertaining to modernity and what Professor Patrick BOULTE emphasized about individualization. The interaction between an individual existence and social existence. This is a very significant thing. And of course, under the circumstances of war, when human communities act together, we understand media communities, military communities, the solidarity that was mentioned by Mr. BOULTE is absolutely subsequently growing. And our moderator also mentioned this, that solidarity is growing naturally. But this is an interesting thing, whether this is a movement forward or this is a movement backward, or this is a circle movement. Of course, modernization and post-modernization were moving in the direction of enhancing individualism. Individualism that is growing to the level of atomization. When with the new technologies and gadgets, we may not know the people with whom we share physical space, although we may have connections with people from different parts of the globe virtually. Since the French Revolution mottos were declared, I'm sorry for my French, liberté, fraternité, égalité, with this fraternité, there are the biggest problems, because brotherhood ceased to be an orientation, a kind of landmark. And even égalité is not such a landmark anymore after the crisis of leftist movements in the world. So that we have only liberté left. So freedom or liberty that is still understood as a freedom of individualism. Is this way reversible or irreversible? I think that Putin and perhaps Xi Jinping and perhaps Iran management think that this is the way, that NATO will be defeated by archaization and flip back from individualism. But I would still agree with IRYNA that there will be no reverse. There will be something new in principle, that in the context of the philosophy of culture, it would be interesting for all of us to see and to describe and even to define. And meanwhile, as long as we have war, and as long as we are facing this cultural identification defined by war and determined by war, of course, the first question on the agenda is looking for unity, for some senses and values that would help unite and consolidate Ukrainian society, that would give it this vivacity and ability to be sustainable as a nation, as a state community. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have gone the whole cycle of the first reflection, and at the end of this cycle, I would like to start our conversation with the audience who gathered in this virtual hall, and then switch on to comments and questions. There is a function, raise your hand. If you know how to do it, please use it. If you don't know, then declare your intention to speak in some other way, please.
Так, дякую. Є перша піднята рука.
Thank you very much. We have the first raised hand. Unfortunately, I cannot introduce you because I can see only your last name. So I pass the floor to Mr. or Mrs. Pasichnik.
Доброго. Представтеся, будь ласка.
Hello to you. Please introduce yourself. I am Vasil Pasichnik. I am a docent of the Department of State Management at the at the Lviv Polytechnic University. I have the following question to the speakers. How much is the following question viewed in the West? The question of cultural imperialism, because Russian Empire emerged in the 13th, 14th centuries, but in order to provide for its existence in the lands that belonged to Kievan Rus, it decided to reject the subjectivity, the subject of our existence. So it was Moscovia, then it got renamed into Russian, which is actually a Greek version of Ruthenian or Ruth. So they sort of appropriated all our culture, and then we were faced with the problem that Kiev is the kind of nation that is negating their imperialistic myth that they had created. And in order to consolidate their own national identity, Ukrainians go back to their Ukrainian myth about Cossacks. And this is the version of history that underlines our history from Kiev in Kievan Rus, then to the Cossacks in Zaporizhia, and then up until the 20th century when we had the emergence of the Ukrainian independent state. So my question is, do they view in the West the question of cultural imperialism that pertains not only to the 1920s or the 19th century, but also the 10th, the 11th century, the legacy that contemporary Moscovia is a quasi-Kievan Rus, and Ukraine is the genuine Rus, but because we were facing our loss of our ability in order to preserve our roots and to continue and to preserve the continuity of our national identity, to preserve ourselves as an independent state, we had to struggle. We had hetmanhood liquidated, we had Cossacks at the Zaporizhia siege destroyed, and Ukrainians were suffering from serfhood in the 19th century. So these were the circumstances. Mr. Pasechnik, I think we understood you. If you want to hear reflection on your question, then I would like to refer. I don't know if I do the right thing, but I would like to invite MYROSLAV SHKANDRII to respond, because he's the one who represents the Western academia, because I understand that Professor Shevelov invested half of his life in order to deconstruct at least half of the Russian myth. Yes, of course, this is being discussed in a very active way. You have to understand that until the recent years, the majority of all the professors and all the departments of Slavonic studies and Slavonic history were, if they were to teach something about Eastern Europe or Russia, they had the staff from Russia or Russians or people with Russian mentality, with pro-Russian attitudes. Only recently do we have books written by Ukrainians or from a Ukrainian perspective on the past. And these questions are being now very actively discussed because of the war, because of what happened on the 24th of February. Everything this was shifted, everything exploded in the West. Many professors who were teaching some historical disciplines ceased doing this the way they used to do it, and now they are trying to include the Ukrainian topic into this discussion.
Я перейшов на українську мову, але я скажу також це, що ця дискусія про...
I apologize that I switched into Ukrainian, but all this discussion about Ukrainian imperialism, this is all tightly connected to post-colonialism with decolonization. This is a part of one great discussion, colony, empire, and Ukraine was under the pressure of a huge state, Russian state, and it had to cope with this situation. It was both political and economical imperialism, and to a great extent, this is a colonial situation. But I would like to say something different also. In the West, we have developed the notion of cultural imperialism or post-colonial studies, but in the sphere of culture, this is how people think, how they see themselves and others, and how psychologically a hegemonic culture impacts its own people. In this context, I mean Russians, and the people whom it is trying to force think about themselves as people of less significance.
Дуже розвинена тема тепер. Вона
This is
міжнародна.
a highly developed topic now. It's kind of international.
Корінних
It's
населення.
being discussed in Asia, in the indigenous peoples of North America, in Great Britain. And there is this understanding that we had to respond, we had to think of ourselves as an inferior people. And there was this humiliating attitude. And this is something that was perpetuated by the subjugated nations themselves. People just take in this attitude. We can talk about economic imperialism, political imperialism, but I believe that we need to employ this methodology, these mechanisms, and these approaches that were elaborated as part of post-colonial studies. And it's not necessarily about cultural imperialism. Thank you very much for this answer. I want to add that one of the best connoisseurs of Ukrainian Baroque, the professor of history and philosophy, Dmytro Czyżewski, in the 1920s, early 1930s, defended this statement of incomplete Ukrainian culture. And in the 1990s, when Ukraine finally became an independent and full-fledged state, Volodymyr Yeshkelev compiled an anthology entitled Pleroma. And basically, it was a direct discussion with Czyżewski because there was this long tradition of inferiority. Pleroma from Greek means completeness, fullness. And this known allegory of completeness is a pregnant woman with a bowl, and this bowl is a spring, basically. So basically, this bowl is always full. So this is something that was not understandable for the Ukrainian culture itself. And this is something that was overlooked and was under the radar for centuries and centuries. Maybe that's why we cannot really look at ourselves in an unbiased manner. So it doesn't really mean something is the same. It just means that maybe we can have a look at the situation differently. Any other questions, comments, or inputs? I can see a raised hand from Pavlo Smitsnyuk. Over to you. Thank you very much. A very stimulating discussion. And I have a question that pertains to the influence of the war on culture and on how Ukrainian culture will be developing from now on. Mr. ROZUMNY said that we might see some interesting and not always positive implications of the war for the culture. I like Clause's idea, who said that the war imposes its own rules of the game. And like in a tango dance, we have to follow the moves of the war. And sometimes this defeat can be an imitation. So we defeat the enemy, we throw the enemy back, but this is something that will have a ripple effect for us as well. We're talking about the Russian world. So maybe this rejection is an imitation. Do you see this already? So maybe by rejecting the Russian language, the Russian culture, we're also rejecting some of the components of our own culture. And where is the piece of imitation in this rejection strategy? I'm not really sure whether I articulated my view clearly. Your question is clear. I would like to illustrate one example here. I think this example is well known in the Ukrainian media space. There's one statement saying that the Russians came because in Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk, people were predominantly Russian-speaking. If they didn't speak Russian, the Russians would not have come there. And I think it's a classical description of the situation that you referenced. consciously we accept the rules of the game of our adversary. Putin and the ideology of the Russian world declared that the Russian world is where the Russian language is spoken. Therefore, Russia has the right to claim these territories. And sometimes we are guided by the same logic. And this is something that we also say to our own citizens, even though the bulk of these citizens galvanized into action to protect their country. So from a political perspective, these people are resisting the adversary, but we are still using the same criterion imposed by the enemy. Well, maybe you are Ukrainians, you took up arms, but you're not really genuine Ukrainians. We have to discipline you because you continue speaking Russian. It's like with COVID. What's the issue with the coronavirus? The immune response is extreme or it's extravagant. So it's the same situation. The immune response is exaggerated, and this is something that creates a conflict in the Ukrainian society. So we are demonstrating integration. We are trying to shape our own standards. But because of this external statement imposed on us, we can see the opposite effect. I think I will pause here. I would like to add something to the Russian world and the Ukrainian world. There's one question that I've been asking myself in the recent months. What is the difference? A lot of people said that as of August 1991, the Russian society was quite democratic, and it was capable of defending the borders of this democracy, because basically the Russian civil society took to the streets and they started rallying outside the building of the State Duma. And they did not really let a power grab in the late 1980s. And as a result, Ukraine was able to separate itself from this violent ship. And a lot of Ukrainians felt that their necks were under the block, but basically they did not really buy a ticket on board the ship. But there's one important thing that we haven't mentioned yet. For over 20 years, Ukrainians have been building something that I call a cruelty-free society. We were subjected to enormous violence and cruelty. We as individuals and we as a society. So we were repressed as Soviet citizens, and we were subjected to all sorts of adversities from early childhood and throughout our professional careers. And if you insisted on your own identity, you had to take the brunt of it as Ukrainians as well. So only those Ukrainians became successful in this statehood building that rejected their identity. And the price of having this career was the rejection of their national identity. And in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was one characteristic of Mr. Gorbachev. He was very empathetic, and this is something that was not typical of the previous leaders of the Soviet project. And this is something that is not typical of the future leaders of the Russian project. So the 1990s were tough times for Ukraine, but not as tough as for the Russians, because this is the only image that the Russians still have. But once again, it's all about making a state person-oriented. It's all about having this Dia app on our smartphones. It's all about improving interaction between the state and citizens. It's about not repressing and oppressing your citizens. So these are the processes that we are observing in Ukraine right now. In fact, the war is pushing us back to the archaism that we did not really pursue because we did not really brace our society for the war. Unlike Putin, we prepared our society for peaceful and developmental trajectory. And I feel like a fraud in front of my students because 10 years ago, I told them that they should pursue the ideals of peace. So this is the framework that they had to function in. So it had to be about fair play, but unfortunately there is no fair play. And it's one of the consequences of this war. Even if we do not acknowledge the post-trauma stress disorder, a lot of Ukrainians have turned out to be resilient, but we will still have repulsion towards everything Russian. I'm not even talking just about the Russian language. So this revulsion will still be there for decades and decades and come. And I think that the next generation will be even more repelled by everything Russian than my generation. Our time is coming to its end. So before I give the floor back to our panelists for some final remarks, I would like to ask our audience whether there's any other urgent question that needs to be voiced. I would like to share some of the generic statements, nothing profound. As you said, Ukrainian culture is a far cry from the Russian culture, as you said, because Ukrainian culture had this piety towards peasants, towards women. It's woman-centered. Just read the pieces by Shevchenko or explore the literature of the 1920s. And it's completely distinct from the aggressiveness, from the desire to dominate. The rattling of war sabers that we can see in the Russian culture. And I also want to revert to the previous question. I don't think it's a bad thing that Ukrainians are trying to return certain personalities and figures. Russians make this claim that every great personality from Ukraine is part and parcel of the Russian world. But the Ukrainian history and the Ukrainian culture have their own dynamics. Odessa-based artists and fighters should be incorporated into this Ukrainian process as well. I don't really want to raise the issue of Bulgakov in Kyiv. What about Bahritsky and some other ones? These are the people that lived and created on the Ukrainian land among the Ukrainians. They were Russian fighters, but if you read their pieces, you will see some of the Ukrainian sentiments there. You will find the Ukrainian topics. You will see some convergences with the Ukrainian culture. So they were part and parcel of the Ukrainian space. This is something that we are doing in the West as well. Delaunay, Archipenko, there are a lot of other artists and writers that lived and created here. I think it's not a bad thing that we are imitating, that we're trying, the Russians, that we're trying to deprive them of certain personalities and figures. Well, I would like to wrap up this issue and note that sometimes you can outsmart the adversary, so you don't really have to emulate or mimic the adversary. On the front line, I can see that we are getting an upper hand. But as for the cultural initiative, I think it's been in our hands since day one of the war. And it's phenomenal, because I don't really think that back in 2014, we as a society and cultural institutions were ready to take this blow, withstand, weather through it, and offer our own agenda. And it looks like we are already ready to offer our own agenda and not just accept the one that is being imposed on us by Russia. Irina, there's one question in the chat. I'm not really sure that we have enough time for it. I can see this question. I will try to read it.
Is it possible to get a sense of the different social groups in Ukraine in ideological political terms? I understand that it may be difficult in the kind of opposition to Russia's war, but it is still important to get a sense of the various groups in Ukraine and how they signify politically. Note, I would also appreciate the references to Ukrainian Baroque and the pleroma of fullness. Many thanks, Fernando Herrero from the UK. Who's ready to take this on?
Можливо, я спробую. Я правильно зрозумів питання.
I will give it a try. Well, I'm not really sure that I got the question right, especially because of this note about pleroma. But I think the question is about different groups. I mean, it's not really about any specific time frame. Well, I think we are mostly interested in the current times, because right now we have a new point for understanding. In the Ukrainian society, under the influence of this national mobilization, there are certain trends, political, ideological trends, that take on a completely new dimension and orientation. In the Ukrainian society, we didn't really have this clear distinction between the right and the left. I'm talking about the legal and political domains. The political forces shaped their programs on an ad hoc basis. But under the influence of modernity, these ideological masks are being revived. And this is something that I can see in the public and patriotic realm. So we have this juxtaposition between the right and the left. And during wartime, this is something that is being imbued with new content, new connotations, including political and ideological connotations. So if there are people that are steeped in ideological trends, like, for example, if we have a look at the US politics, are you for Trump or for Obama? This context of the ideological opposition in the rest of the world is also being translated into the Ukrainian reality. I really hope that the war will have a positive resolution for Ukraine, and we will not really have to wait for it for a long time. But what can we expect post-war? The juxtaposition between the right and the left, because we can see the rights winning in Italy or fighting for power in Brazil. They also have their representatives in US politics. So from this perspective, I think that the Ukrainian situation will be more ideologized, and there will be an even more fierce juxtaposition there, because those people that were galvanized into action because of the war tend to be more unequivocal, categorical, and they have better determined or defined views and sentiments. Thank you very much for this thought. Any other statement that someone would like to make?
I would also say that we don't know what will happen. Of course, wars make people be categorical and to stand up for their views. We don't know how this will be manifested in the political sphere, but if we talk about the past, the only possible answer to this would be to look at the political currents, political parties that existed over 100 years. I mean, the last century. And sometimes I'm explaining this to my students, that all the politically active Ukrainians, they have all suffered from their political activity, be it Marxists, I mean, in 1917 and 1920s, who were members of the Bolshevik Party, who were fighting for the Ukrainization of their society. They were Zionists, then the 30s nationalists, then dissidents, who sometimes were, so to say, orthodox in their fight. If you are not fighting for human rights, if you have nothing against state, they were all, however diversified in their views, they were all suffering for being active Ukrainians. And today, as we look at this history, I think we can understand that something different was happening in Ukraine, that it was a struggle for nation, for existence, and people are aware of this. Under certain circumstances, they may not agree, they may argue, but there is common aim, political aim. There is military task, and I think this is what changes the situation. Professor ROZUMNY is right when he says that to compare it with the Western reality and use the Western patterns for Ukrainian, to apply it to Ukrainian society, that would not be good, and it doesn't fit. Thank you. I think that we are now in the middle of intensive description and detailization, and I am grateful to all the listeners who have gathered around this discussion. And it's great to know that we are now being viewed on the Facebook of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, but also at the Faculty of the Social Sciences of the Ukrainian Catholic University. And then this recording will stay in the network and you will be able to review it. Thank you very much for this work, because it was an intensive thinking online, live. Thank you for having gathered here, and thank you for being a nice audience, because we could feel that the message reached you. So I bend my head in front of our speakers. That's Dr. Patrick BOULTE, Dr. MYROSLAV SHKANDRII, and Dr. MAKSYM ROZUMNY, and also Dr. Pavlo Smitsnyuk, who is one of the organizers and who is the director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies. And thank you for being so responsive. Thank you, and all the best.